Okay, I'd like to welcome you to a special evening panel of challenges of life on Mars, and by which we meant human life on Mars. Okay, because the microbes that are living on Mars, if they're there, have already mastered it. So, or not, but if they're there, they have. Okay, so one way or another, they've settled it. But anyway, this is a panel on the challenges of a human Mars settlement. And the panelists include me, it includes Bruce McKenzie, includes Gene Hunter, who is a professor of bioengineering at Cornell University, and who, by the way, has been overseeing the food science research at the Mars Desert Research Station, and Bishop Heiser. Okay. And so I guess the first talk will be given by Bruce or Bishop Heiser, something?
Oh, well, I'd be more than happy to.
Okay, I'll be brief.
Okay.
But I'm going to start with something that will make someone cringe. When I was kind of getting my mind set for this talk, I heard the quote, "I'm not going to be stuck in a Mars hab with a pregnant goat." Can you folks hear me? Can you hear me in the back? Okay. So we were discussing basically food and do you want animals there? I was thinking, do you want soy cheese on your cheeseburger or soy cheese on your soy burger? Goat cheese or dairy cheese. And so I was thinking, well, you send a pygmy goat, a female pygmy goat with the frozen embryos of the particular variety of goat that you really want, and we came up with that quote. But obviously the initial challenges are food, clothing, and shelter, and variations on that. Like your outdoor clothing has to stand pressure, and your shelter has to stand radiation. And you also have communication, safety, the whole entry, descent, and landing, return flight, which is in my mind optional, and medical issues, personality. There's also part of the initial challenges are just getting the whole mission financed, the politics, the personalities, all that stuff. So I just basically made that list, and you've just heard it. So.
Well, what more is there to be said? Now that we no longer have to worry about where our cheese is coming from, and that Bruce doesn't want us to bring him home.
No, it's my lawyer you don't need to bring home.
Oh, okay, very good. That's touching on a couple of those points. When looking at the topic of initial challenges for a Mars colony, I usually think of the initial challenges being not once you've gotten there, because then you've actually already surmounted the initial challenges. The initial challenges are multitudinous. Having the will to go to Mars in the first place for exploration, having the wherewithal to invest the time, the energy, the money, as you observed, into the process of developing the necessary technologies. This being said, we've done some of the preliminaries, but nothing substitutes for the actual on-the-ground experiments and experience. But behind all of this is, as I will continue to beat on the same drum as I do from year to year, is the point that civilizationally, you have to have already made the decision that you are a spacefaring people before you actually carry it off. And that is, in fact, where I think the greatest initial challenge is. This is not something where we simply drift this way inevitably and inexorably to making these things happen, but rather there's a very conscious and expensive, among other things, process that leads up to this point. It is not about only money, as Robert and many others have highlighted various aspects of this, proposed various plans for how to pull off this stunt. It costs a whole lot less to set up a colony on Mars than it did to wage war in Iraq. But there was no, whatever your view of that situation was, that's simply a fact. And it's not to play the one goal against the other. But it is worth observing that it was not hard to build a national consensus for quite extraordinary commitments, both of material and of capital. to pull off that endeavor. Whereas with this one, I was glad to see that at least with the press coverage of us that we received today, that they did make sure that they reported the fact that we weren't all wearing Star Trek uniforms or something. I remember how they worded that in the Fort Worth newspaper. We've got a long ways to go in terms of having people conceive of this as not merely a nebulously worthy goal, but something that actually needs to happen, as something which is related to the core values of our culture, of our civilization, and as something which is necessary for the preservation of an entire way of life. It's seen too often as a optional add-on, as if, well, if we can do this when we've solved our other problems, then all well and good. And I know every one of us has spoken to that aspect of this over time. But the problem is you really have to surmount that. You have to have people having, in the main, the understanding that the civilization needs to continue to expand and to thrive if it's going to survive. It's not a matter of us being able to turn in on ourselves and declare that we have ours now and forever. That's how civilizations perish, and deservedly so. The historical precedents for that are many. As the discussion goes on and we want to move beyond, perhaps in a little while, the initial challenges to later challenges, the problems of people living in an environment where they are millions of miles from home. There are human factors involved. Their home, yes, but the transition to that, Robert, as you know, is not one where you simply flip a switch in your head. We'll get to those topics in a little while, and with that, I'll be quiet and let you talk.
Okay. Well, as is typical of professors, I suppose, I decided to get all boring and make you a PowerPoint. So I've made a list of the challenges that occur to me as initial challenges, both in design of a mission to Mars, whether it's one way or two ways, and some of the challenges that the new settlers or occupants of the outpost, the voyagers, will face when they get there. So if you'll pardon me for just a bit, I'll run through these real fast.
We haven't seen them.
The first type of challenge that the mission designers and the new settlers will face are life support challenges. And the first among these is power, because nothing can be accomplished without power. Before the mission even leaves, before the mission, before many of the design aspects are completed, it will have to be decided what kind of power is going to be used: nuclear, solar photovoltaic, or unlikely solar thermo. How will we get our oxygen, and will we recycle it? How will we take care of contaminants in the atmosphere? Where will we get our water, and will we recycle it? How will we recycle it? There's a whole big food system to be designed, and I'll be talking about that a little bit on Sunday morning. We also need to manage the solid waste, because no one's going to come and pick up the garbage for us on Mars. EVA and local transportation: how do we get around, and what do we wear when we're out on the road? And finally, if we're looking at a settlement mission, labor is not quite as much of an issue as it might be for a scientific mission, but we have to understand that much of the technology we'll send there is new and will have to be looked after on a fairly constant basis until it's broken in and working well and routine. Logistics refers to the supplies and materials, the spare parts that are needed for life support, maintenance and repair, any sort of maintenance and repair. So a good deal of planning is going to have to go into what's going to be needed and how it's going to be sent when it's needed, or made from scraps and spare materials when it's needed. Besides life support challenges, we have biomedical challenges. Gravitational biology is kind of a binary field. There is some data at, there's plenty of data at unit gravity. There's a little bit of data at 0 gravity, and there's very little data at all at any other degree of gravity. So we have no idea about the hypergravity effects on the body systems of the Martian settlers. Someone's going to have to look after that from the moment they arrive. Okay. Availability of medical care, who is going to be providing medical care, what sorts of medical care might need to be provided, what will they eat, and will there be any special nutritional or dietary needs for a Mars settlement. Sleep and hygiene, sleep is important for mental health, it's important for physical health. Astronauts currently have a lot of trouble sleeping because it's difficult for them to find a nice, quiet, secluded place to sleep, and I expect that in an early stage colony with noisy machinery going all the time to manage the life support, this is going to be an issue as well. No one knows much about the exercise and fitness requirements for life in hypergravity. We understand that some radiation protection is needed, but the people that go to Mars will endure a chronic elevated radiation dose for the rest of their lives. They will be, in a sense, guinea pigs for the high radiation lifestyle, and the effects will need to be studied, need to be looked out for, and need to be countermanded with perhaps antioxidants, gene therapy. Who knows what sorts of treatments might be available when we get ready to send people to Mars. So far, finally, reproduction, birth, and pediatric care. This has never been addressed in a space context except for little fishies and rats. So there's a lot to be learned here. Isolation and confinement issues have been studied, have been endured by explorers since the early explorers set out from Europe to explore the New World, from Iceland perhaps to explore the New World, and from China. Even the ancient Polynesians were explorers. All of these people lived in isolation and during their voyage in confinement on their small craft. There are many group social issues that go along with isolation and confinement, which will have to be solved during, or before, during, and continuing on with a small colony. Those include the issue of privacy. Where do you go for solitude? And the issue of leisure time activities. We're all used to having some leisure time. Will our settlers have any? How can they spend it? One aspect of isolation and confinement is that very often there's a sense of an adversarial relationship between the explorer group and the mission support or mission control back down on the ground. This is going to have to be dealt with, again, by planning and during the mission. And finally, if we send a small group up to Mars to settle, there's going to be stresses and adaptations involved either in expanding that colony with new people or reintegration of the voyagers when they come back home, if they come back home. Okay. Now, many of these challenges can be either eliminated or mitigated by pre-planning. Above all, we need to be aware of the complexity of the system that we're going to send to Mars, that we're going to establish on Mars, and the complexity of the society that's going to be established on Mars, small as it may be. From a technical standpoint, for an initial colony, we may wish to design the subsystems, air handling, water recycling, ISRU, to be as independent of each other as possible so that they can be tested more or less in isolation or independently, and then mated together after individual system testing, so that the complexity of the system can be understood more slowly and more completely. One very important point is to make all the information available to all the designers. It doesn't do to keep some of the designers and technologists in ignorance of what's going on with other subsystems. Everyone has to have access to everybody else's work, and I believe that will call for some sort of advanced electronic database and search engine capability to keep everybody abreast of everyone else's work to the extent that they wish to be informed. Okay. Along with that, in developing the life support system, the habitat, and so forth, it will be necessary to document the rationale, the history, and the provenance of the requirements, the design requirements, and the decisions that are made. There have been a lot of snafus at NASA that came about because a requirement was established, and then from that point forward, it was treated as carved in stone when perhaps the rationale for it had evaporated. And finally, again, learning from NASA's lessons, we need to test the subsystems and the linkages between systems under off-nominal conditions, that is, unusual conditions, as well as under conditions in which they're supposed to operate. I work at MDRS. I run a food study down there, and I'm finding that the feedback that I get from this in-the-loop, human-in-the-loop testing of a food system is absolutely invaluable. The same will go for human-in-the-loop testing for any other technology that's brought to bear on a Mars settlement. There are all sorts of people that are interested in becoming part of the testing, becoming the humans in the testing loop, and their training and their feedback as part of the design process will be very valuable to the designers and the technologists. And it's also important to keep testing even after launch, so that in the 6 months that will pass before our crew gets to Mars, we may, on the ground, still be finding problems and designing solutions for those problems to support our colonists. Bishop Heiser talked about sticking to a plan and having a commitment to a plan. We have to do that as designers as well as a society. Every mission plan is complex. Every mission plan is longer than you think it's going to be. Every mission plan has a capacity for budget creep and slipped schedules. In hindsight, if we look back 20 years after the Mars settlement begins, we'll find mistakes that we've made. They weren't mistakes when we made them. They become mistakes in hindsight. But we have to expect that to happen because we are, after all, human beings. And a very important issue is that the plan does not end with the mission. The plan has to keep going because settling Mars is not a one-shot deal. It is going to continue on for tens and hundreds and perhaps thousands of years as we become a spacefaring species. Project management in itself will be a challenge, okay? If we consider this as a fast-paced 10-year project, it will require more to succeed than just enthusiasm, funding, and superb science, okay? All of which I think we can say that we have a line on. We have great enthusiasm here. We have access to superb science from the space agencies and from independent technology development organizations, small industry, independent consultants, and I believe that the money will be found. However, the management needs to be exemplary. We're taking a voyage on behalf of humanity. Our project is exemplary, our project is noble, our management needs to be noble as well. There's no room for covering your ass and sugarcoating stuff when when your goal is to send human beings to Mars. There's a story about management decisions, okay? And the top management floated a balloon to the workers on the plant floor. And they asked, "What do you think of it?" And they said, "This is a crock of you know what, and it stinks unbearably. Well, the first line managers heard that, and they said, we can't use that kind of language when we talk to top management. So what they said was that this is organic fertilizer, and it's extremely strong. Okay. And the next line management said, we know what this is supposed to say, and we can't let our next level management hear this kind of language. So what they said is that this material is the best thing for growth, okay? And it's the strongest way that we can promote growth. And when top management heard that, they said, this is going to be the way to grow the company. And the decision was taken. So this is called sugarcoating, and we can't let it happen. Okay. Finally, we need to have what might be called an enviable workplace. People back in the Apollo era would have, they would have worked for NASA for free because it was just a place to be to develop wonderful technology. Nowadays, Apple, Google, SpaceX perhaps, there are places that are just exactly the place that everybody wants to work. Well, our project needs to be the place that everyone wants to work, not just because our mission is noble, not just because our technology is superb, but because we're a great group of people to work with. Okay? And so that has to be part of the corporate culture, the group culture of putting people on Mars. It's going to be good for our outreach, it's going to be good internally, and it's going to inspire the people that go to Mars and have to endure our mistakes and our shortcomings as technologists. Outreach is going to have to continue, not just to maintain government interest and funding, but also to respond effectively to critics, because there will always be critics, internal critics, people who disagree about a certain technology decision, external critics, people who can't imagine why we might want to go to Mars. Outreach is necessary to spin off terrestrial benefits, which will in turn help get other people on board. And finally, outreach is necessary to reaffirm why we're doing this. Okay? We're not doing this just because we love technology, just because Mars is a cool place to be, but we're doing this as a service to humanity, to fulfill our human destiny of spaceflight and becoming an interstellar species. Okay. So thank you for your attention, and we'll open up the panel now. Thank you.
All right. I'm a last-minute addition to this panel because originally Joe Palea was going to be on it, and he unfortunately couldn't make it to the conference. The panel, one of the topics it's supposed to address is the challenges of a Mars colony, not just a Mars mission or a Mars base. And so I guess what I'm going to address myself to is the challenge of becoming a Mars colony as opposed to a base. Okay, that is to say, an actual town, a branch of human civilization, an institution that is truly human, not. I'm not loud enough?
He's never heard that before.
Yeah, this is new. Okay. Can you hear me now? Yes. All right. A base is a necessary phase of the development of humanity on Mars. There's no doubt about it. But it's a phase. And it has to be transitioned into, and it has to be transitioned out of. Okay. I mean, for example, at a Mars base, if you are the manager of a base, would you want your personnel to have children? Okay. It's very unbusinesslike. It's very unprofessional having all these little rugrats running around when work is to be done. There's a fundamental difference. There's a sterility to the idea of a base. You know, I was once at a conference where some NASA person said that all personnel going to a Mars base would need to be sterilized to make sure that they did not have children, because it would be tremendously inconvenient to the work of a base for people to have children. Okay, you know, but this is the bureaucratic mentality. This is inimical to life. Okay, in this sense, in the truest sense of the term, and I see a certain matter of conflict arising between the human impulses of the personnel at the base, okay, who would prefer to be persons than personnel, and the kind of regulations and structures and strictures that apply to a base. And in a way, you know, in a generic sense, this is sort of the issue of the American Revolution, in that the British concept of what the colonies were for was that they were for Britain, that they existed to make money for Britain. Okay, whereas for the colonies existed as for them. And this created a certain divergence of goals and so forth, and at a certain point conflict. And at a certain point, while the colonies could not have been established without the protection of the British Navy and British institutions, at a certain point it had to break out of that mold if it was to proceed and develop into what it could develop. And I think this is the fundamental issue. You know, would the base manager want the personnel, you know, creating community orchestras, and you know, should we allow clarinets to be imported to Mars? No, I mean it. The issue, I mean, we see it another way. What about if the colonists, the base personnel, were to develop a kind of plant that could exist outside of greenhouse domes, and they would want to spread it out onto Mars? If the base is conceived of as a scientific institution there to study Mars, then there would be an imperative not to alter Mars in any way, not to let any organisms escape out onto Mars. Okay, whereas clearly, and there would be an aesthetic that we want to keep Mars in as original a form as possible. We don't want to contaminate it. We don't want to alter the environment. We don't want to do this. We don't want to do that. I mean, the ultimate question here, but is further down the road than these sorts of questions, is the question of terraforming. You know, are we there to study Mars as a natural object, or are we there to create a new branch of human civilization? The colonists will want to alter Mars without question. And, you know, I mean, if we're talking here, you know, 2040s, you know, Earth will probably be governed by robots by that time.
It already was.
Yeah, it is. You know, and people at the, in fact, if you think about it, it is already. The bureaucracy is essentially a way of making people in authority behave as if they were robots. But that's another issue. But whereas the government, I mean, look, Mars is going to want to govern itself. They're going to want to determine their own priorities. And their priorities will be enhancing their own lives rather than fulfilling duties for a base administration or a space authority back on Earth. And this is how it's going to have to go eventually. It will have to break free. It will have to develop its own institutions. It will have to be able to govern itself. It will have to have the freedom to alter the environment as needed. It will have to have the freedom to institute new technologies. I mean, you know, one extremely important technology right now that is in peril is the genetically modified organisms, which have tremendous potential for increasing crop yields and increasing the nutritional values of crops. And they are currently being greatly impeded by people who call themselves environmentalists, at tremendous expense, by the way, to major parts of the world. I mean, you know, there's this kind of rice called golden rice that's been developed that is rich in vitamin A, and vitamin A afflicts many very poor people all over the third world. Vitamin A deficiency, I mean, they go blind. People who are too poor to afford vegetables and have to eat just cereals, many of them go blind. And they've got new kinds of cereals that include many of the vitamins that are in vegetables, such as this golden rice, and you have European governments refusing to accept any imports from third world nations that use such crops. Well, let alone let it be used domestically. This sort of thing, these sorts of regulations on Mars, where you have agriculture limited to greenhouses, and you know, it's much more constrained in acreage than anything that we've ever experienced on Earth. They're going to want to have crops that have the maximum possible yield per square meter, and they're going to want to invoke technologies that may be frowned upon by politically correct robots on Earth. And they're going to have to find a way to break free. They're going to have to find a way to break free and skirt and circumvent and undermine precisely institutions that made the base functional during a certain earlier phase of its existence. This is going to be the ultimate challenge of the Mars base, how to stop being a base. Okay? And for the Mars base, for its personnel to assert their humanity. Because the ultimate question, I mean, look, why is it important to go to Mars? I mean, there are certain reasons that are respectable. We can go there to do scientific research, to find out if life is a general phenomenon in the universe. And certainly this discovery announced yesterday reinforces that rationale for the reason. But that is ultimately a rationale. It's not the reason. The reason why it's ultimately important that humanity goes to Mars is that humanity become a multi-planet species. You know, in other words, the ultimate reason to go to Mars is not to do scientific research. That, you know, it's like going to America to find the spice route to the Indies. Okay, well, Columbus didn't find the spice route to the Indies, but if he had, it really wouldn't have added anything much to the significance of what he did. Ultimately, what he did was make all this possible. That's the significance. That's why it's really a noteworthy episode in human history. And so the challenge of the Mars base is going to be to realize how it can stop being a base.
So I think we should take questions, and a reminder that the topic, even though we strayed from it, is initial challenges for a Mars colony. I see one challenge is to change their name from colony to settlement, but who has a question or a comment?
I had to leave the room for just a moment, so pardon if you've already covered this territory. But I just want to pose a situation. The first murder on the moon colony, or any sort of criminal activity across cultures, across faiths, across nations, because I'm assuming at this point the Mars colony is going to be open and welcoming to all cultures, all faiths, all nations. How is that potential base or colony administrator going to handle such a situation?
And that's obviously a matter that's going to have to be addressed with whatever form of a charter is governing it in the first place. The point that Robert was making with regard to a base, I mean, you're going to be dealing with a governmental regulatory system that's there before you even leave Earth. But in terms of a colony, how they will self-govern will be a matter of a community contract, and it is entirely possible, since if we're going to continue to build off the analogy of prior expansions of civilizations, that we don't know what shape various colonies may take. Some may be very exclusive in terms of their point of origin, others may be not. But legal questions like that will be up to them. That waits to be seen.
Well, it's a very interesting question. Now, you know, the Pilgrims came over, they signed on the ship the Mayflower Compact, essentially establishing themselves as the government. Okay? Jamestown colony, on the other hand, was basically governed by a representative of the Queen, or the King, rather. And, you know, if there was a space station mission right now and there was a murder on the space station, okay, I think it's pretty clear that the matter would be settled by legal authorities on Earth. They'd say, bring that person down, it will be tried here, okay? And if the people on the space station attempted to settle it themselves, it would be deeply frowned upon, okay? On the other hand, I mean, at a certain point, I think in a Mars colony, the people there are very much going to want to settle itself, okay? Especially if you're talking about a murder, and especially if you're talking about a legal system on Earth similar to what we currently have. Well,
that may be the case eventually, but I don't see how that's really practicable in that early period and in a period of transition.
well, but that's fundamentally the difference between a Mars base
And a colony.
and a Mars colony or a Mars republic, okay? And then how, if they do get the power to settle it, how they do choose to settle it themselves we can't predict that. That will depend upon their culture and their norms and their ideas of justice, okay? But I think ultimately, though, whatever the authority is to deal with that is going to have to transition to there. Because I believe certainly that whatever their ideas are, they will diverge from those that prevail on Earth. I mean, I cannot see having a prison at Mars, for example. I mean, you know, that is, there could be some forms of non-capital punishment, but they would not be prisons. The idea of keeping someone and feeding them and just holding them there in a state of half-life for years or decades,
Worse than at least for the community.
okay, is absurd in the context of a Mars, early Mars settlement. And so how they choose to settle that, well, they'll find their own way. And so and they certainly won't be wanting to ship people back to Earth for trial. It's, but that's just it.
Let me just clarify the issue of penalties and punishment. You can't afford to not have a person's labor. Their labor is so valuable that you can't take them out of the workforce. So any kind of penalty or prison term has to be restrictions, but where they're still doing useful work. And also, going back on cultural differences, we've had cultural differences for many years. A good example is on board ship. You'll have, a few people from one country on the crew and a few people from another country. And if there's just one person from that country and that people from that country aren't well known, then they become the representative of their culture, and for better or for worse. We've also had that in the Mars simulations in Russia, where there were cultural and gender misunderstandings, rather extreme. So anyway.
I think most of us here, myself included, are pretty big proponents of Mars colonization. But one of the more legitimate concerns I've heard voiced regarding Mars colonization is the health and welfare of the children that are going to be born there, especially when you consider they won't be there by choice, unlike the initial settlers. And obviously, as proponents of Mars colonization, we're all generally pretty optimistic that the first generations will adapt and survive to a new environment and everything will be fine. But to imagine a worst case scenario, let's suppose we go there and as a result of the low gravity, high radiation environment, we see significant developmental problems in children, or reduced lifespan, or that we notice later in life at the age of like 25 or 30, a lot of them get cancer. I was just curious as to how you would address that ethically and also from a practical perspective.
Yeah. Parents have been making choices for their children forever. That's nothing new. A story I'll tell is I was visiting West Berlin, and I was talking to a street vendor, and his pregnant girlfriend came up. She might have been 19 or so. And she was asking me, what would a good country be for her to emigrate to where her child could have citizenship? And that's a rather extreme case of a parent making a decision. But it happens all the time. We certainly need, as far as, I'm not so much worried about radiation. I think the children will be indoors most of the time under good radiation shielding. But by the time you have children, I think you will have good radiation shielding. Let me put it that way. I am worried about low gravity. It's not clear, if the children are going to develop in ways that we consider normal. I think they will develop in ways that are where they are adapted to that gravity. So they may not be able to visit Earth. And we certainly need animal experiments before that happens.
Well, there are immigrants and emigrants all over Earth. People immigrate and emigrate to provide a better future for their children. And when they go to a new place, they take on many unknown dangers. The Korean college graduates who come to New York City and start out as grocery store owners, okay, in order to provide a better future for their children, they subject their families to the dangers of living and working in dangerous neighborhoods, not knowing whether their children will be in a good school or not. So these decisions are made in the face of uncertainty. No one really knows how children will grow and develop in low gravity, and that's something that the colony is going to have to cope with when it begins to happen. The first few children born on Mars will be the pioneers, and we will learn a lot from them. Their parents will learn a lot from them. No one knows what's going to happen until it happens, but I believe strongly that if those children are born sick or if they have terrible problems, that the colony, the parents in the colony will have to find a way to they'll have to figure out what to do, whether that is to not have children and to grow the colony simply by emigration or immigration, or whether they'll start discovering ways to treat the problems that their children are having so that those kids can grow up functional in the Mars environment. It's a big hypothetical.
I wanted to ask Robert about some of the comments that he made in particular. One of the things, of course, what we found is that when the countries in Europe sent colonists and probes to the United States, they okay. Does that help? Okay, fine. I want to take up the idea that Bob talked about, in particular, with respect to the idea that the early colonists that came to the New World, basically they dramatically changed the life there. They destroyed species, they destroyed cultures, all sorts of changes were sort of automatic because they had done this. You have said that you can expect that if we set up a colony on Mars, these people want to be independent, they will want to make adjustments, they may want to grow crops that go into the outside the colony. You're saying in some sense that we can expect that if we build this colony, we will destroy the culture, the life forms and things like that on Mars. Is that what you really mean? Is that what you would expect to happen?
I think we will create a new biosphere on Mars.
That is my question.
Well, okay, I'm going to answer you in full. All right. I do not think that humans will go to Mars and leave the planet perpetually unaltered. Mm-hmm. I think just as humans have not left the Earth unaltered. Now, look, Europeans came to North America, and there was a great deal here already. There were passenger pigeons by the millions, and buffaloes by the millions, and there were Native Americans, and there were redwood forests, and all sorts of things like this. And we came and we drove the passenger pigeons into extinction, and we greatly reduced the herds of buffalo, and we destroyed the Native American culture, and we cut down a good fraction of the redwoods. Okay? But we also created things. We created a continental nation committed to liberty with a population of 300 million people and thousands of universities and tens of thousands of used bookstores and Starbucks.
Exactly.
Okay, there you go. Okay, and this thing not only provided a home for all these people and a refuge for people fleeing genocide and persecution and lack of opportunity. We invented electricity and the phonograph and the aeroplane, and and are responsible for 100% of the people that have ever gone to another world, and 90% of the probes that have ever gone beyond low Earth orbit. Okay, so there was a certain amount, absolutely, that was destroyed, but a great deal was also created. Now, I am one of the, now this is a matter upon which reasonable people can disagree, but I am one of the people who think that far more was created than was destroyed. But I will concede that what was destroyed was certainly measurable and tangible and of some value. Okay? But I would submit to you that had there been nothing in North America but some barren rocks with some mud with ice frozen into it and perhaps some microbial life, and we transformed that into a continental nation committed to liberty, that there would not be people picketing Columbus Day parades right now. That even so, with respect to that environment, something would have been lost, but much less than was actually lost in the transformation of pre-Columbian America to what it is now. So wherever we go, we change things. I think there will be time on Mars to study it to get the answers to whether there is native life on Mars, to characterize it. I think it's extremely unlikely that terrestrial microbes will drive Martian microbes into extinction, because if they could have, they already have, because there is natural transport between the two planets after all. But I think there will be alteration to Mars. Frankly, it's not up to me. It's up to them. I mean, in other words, you know, we sometimes have had debates here at these conferences about whether it's ethical to terraform Mars. And, you know, people get in really sharp points against each other. But at the end of the day, when the decision is made whether or not to terraform Mars, they're not going to go over the minutes of my debates with Chris McKay and figure out who won and make the decision accordingly. They will decide it themselves based upon their beliefs. I happen to believe that knowing people for what we are, in both our positive and negative traits, that we will in fact alter Mars. Okay, but that
just something we should understand.
Yeah.
When we do it, that's what's going to happen.
I believe so. I mean, do you think otherwise? Do you think if the people go to
I'm
Mars?
just asking whether we recognize that when we do this task, this mission, that there will be consequences that we may not all agree with.
Yes. If you have a child, there could be consequences that you don't agree with. Okay? Your child could be the next Einstein, it could be the next Hitler.
That's beside the point. The
Yeah.
point is, if we put that colony down, we should recognize that there are going to be these consequences.
I agree.
That's all.
Yes.
And just to build on that point, because I was reflecting on this while Robert was making his initial comments, I think, in fact, one of the difficulties of this entire consideration is that this is probably the most overanalyzed event that's never happened. The simple fact is we have so many generations now of literature weighing precisely this sort of scenario where it has been kind of dealt to death. This has actually been one of our biggest problems in advancing the agenda, has been because Robert and I like to talk from the North American experiment, when you had New Sweden, when you had New Netherlands, and various other efforts, the French colony that tends to get forgotten about in Florida, that was then wiped out by the Spaniards, with that wonderful line, "We do this not to Frenchmen but to Lutherans," was the phrase. That made us all feel much better. That these were times when very few thought of their course of action as something permanent. One of the few exceptions to that was actually the case of the Pilgrims, who came to the New World with the explicit intention of all is lost for Europe. You had a 30 years war going on, and with this I mean, they were crazy. They also happened to be right in ways that they didn't expect. It was all of the normal people who were coming here for a time on a contract, sometimes with longer commitments than that, who really didn't understand the situation for what it was. The difficulty that we have is that this has been fought almost to death in certain regards and not given enough consideration in others. But one of the things we've fought to death has been the loud and clear trumpeting to the government of what has to go on is as soon as is possible, it must be free and independent. You know, Mars will not be free till it runs red with earth or blood kind of mentality. And you know, what government wants to fund that? Oh yes, let's put ourselves, you're right, a Martian civilization will arise which will cause the people that sent it there to be forgotten as little more than a historical curiosity. Tends to cause the powers that be to say, well, for heaven's sake, we certainly don't want to do that. So that's, I think, part of the difficulty actually of the over-analysis. I believe it's going to happen, but I'm not so much concerned about the ethical implications of us moving the rocks around and trying to warm the place up, as I am about the fact that Homeworld will not be overwhelmingly pleased with the idea that we want to do this in the first place. Not because they care about the microbes, but because Leviathan is never very keen on the idea of allowing anyone out of control. So.
I forget what the subject of the question was, but I have to respond.
Answer it anyhow.
And that is, I think that we are the seed of life for the universe, and I think it's good to spread life. I would hate to see the universe be sterile and devoid of life, and art and beauty and appreciation and science. We can certainly have a planetary park or refuge or preserve on Mars. We can designate parts of Mars to be untouched, although, of course, the climate might change. We can designate certain asteroids to be unexploited so that they can be available for future study or future tourism. But I think we should go. And there will be changes, and that's inevitable, and I think overall the changes will be good.
Thank you.
Oh, and please say your name.
I'm Martin Fowler, and I'm worried about a worst-case scenario. I hope it's not a deal breaker. Not so much about whether people can raise children on Mars, but whether they can actually conceive and gestate children away from the Earth's biosphere, monthly ovarian cycles, and a number of other subtle support systems the human beings have in this environment. That worries me, and I'm not sure how worried I should be about that. So.
Well, people have been able to get pregnant and give birth on on board ships, in houses, in tents, in forests and caves. So I think we can make an environment that is Earth-like enough to have children. I will restate that I'm concerned about the gravity level during development.
The female human is nearly the same monthly cycle as the moon, but it's not quite the same. It doesn't stay sunk up to the moon. It can change. There is no. It's just. I think it's just an accident that it's nearly the same month length.
No, I'm pretty sure that there is an evolutionary reason that the menstrual cycle is the same as the lunar cycle, at least on average. But
why should that be the case? It isn't in other mammals.
Okay. But the point I was going to make is we can still, have children even if we have a roof over our head and we don't see the moon every night. They're applauding us. Any other response to Martin?
Yeah. I would say that if the biological cues are not that important, there are women who get pregnant who have a 3-week menstrual cycle, who have a 6-week menstrual cycle, who have just gotten off the pill and who have no cycle at all. So I wouldn't worry about that. I am, like the rest of the panel, worried about the role of gravity in development and gestation.
There are a few people who are concerned about whether the DNA will fully sequence correctly and stuff. I mean that without very much gravity, but I think they've been able to prove that it works pretty good even in null G.
Yeah, the fish reproduce, mice give birth, astronauts stay up there for 2.5 years and their bumps and bruises heal. So I think it's not going to be that big a deal.
Yeah, I'm not really worried about that. But I do want to say that that you want to keep the goal as the same, but you shouldn't keep a real hard detailed goal. You should keep. There are things you won't be able to plan for. You need to have some flexibility. Follow the plan until you see that it really needs to be changed. You sounded like you said, stick to the plan and we won't vary.
Well, I agree with you that
there's too much unknown.
there will always be needs to revise a plan.
Yeah.
What I would like to, what I'd like the world to commit to, or whoever's going to pay for this expedition, is to see it through. And the number one problem recently with the space program is that every 4 to 8 years the government turns over and they've got a new agenda, and just out of spite they want to get rid of the other guy's agenda and put their new agenda in. And every time that happens, NASA spends 6 months to a year just throwing out all the old plans and starting all the new plans, and it throws all the work into disarray. It's a tremendous waste of time, effort, and money. If they could just stick to one thing, they'd get, who knows where they'd get, at least they get somewhere.
Most of the time it's an 8-year cycle, but sometimes it's 4. I also wanted to say that Mars is so big. If we settle, we're not going to kill all of the life, even where we settle. But I do think that with our ethics and with our wanting to understand everything, we will preserve all life we can find. And I think after we terraform, the life that's there, many will die.
Well, look, here's the thing. Most of the original inhabitants of the Earth were not compatible with oxygen.
Right.
Okay, and so when a certain minority of organisms decided to terraform the Earth and put oxygen in the atmosphere, they made the surface of the Earth uninhabitable for the vast majority of life. But it still exists underground. The large majority of life on Earth is anaerobic organisms that live underground. And, you know, as far as they're concerned, we're just these weird group that lives in the uninhabitable surface. They have most of the Earth, because, you know, most of the Earth is actually underground. And and that's how it is. If we terraform Mars, we're going to terraform the surface of Mars. Most of Mars is underground. And Mars almost certainly has liquid groundwater, as proven by these photographs of these outflow channels created in the past 10 years. And I don't see them being threatened at all by anything happening on the surface.
I would like to ask the panel to, well, this is Tony Muscatello. I'd like the panel to comment for a little bit about an economic system for a Mars colony. I would expect initially it would be if you don't work, you don't eat, as simple as that. But clearly there's something wrong with our system, that the wheels come off every few years or so, and every so often it resists putting the wheels back on, it seems like, actively. So what are your thoughts on what a Mars colony would come up with? Would they even need a monetary system? Would they be able to somehow create something new, or are we too limited in our own swimming in the water that we're in to realize that there could be something else?
Since a monetary system is usually intended to basically serve as a neutral medium for the exchange of goods and labor, if you have if we're talking about an initial colony, which is what I'm going to keep defaulting back to, not what they might develop 200 years from now when I don't have to worry about them. If you're talking about a few dozen people, for starters, any kind of attempt at a system of monetary exchange is irrelevant. The concern is survival, dealing with basic necessities. Luxury goods will probably be according to whatever the standard is that they establish for themselves. But I don't think that an economic system in the sense that we would think of it would really exist. It's more like the economic system of an extended family than of anything that we can really conceptualize of in our own context. But that's just my opinion.
Probably, you might have an economic system between Mars and Earth, though.
That's true. But in terms of them establishing their own exchange system, I think that Robert spoke to that quite eloquently in terms of intellectual properties that would be a means of exchange in terms of trade back home.
I think you would all be partners
which takes it beyond the confines of initial.
Yeah, well, you know, the short answer is, okay, these pilgrims were initially a communalistic system, and it developed into a private property system as it developed. But I think there's a more interesting aspect to this, which is simply the following, that, you know, we here have certain ideas about how society should be organized and governed. And those are our ideas. It's what we've been brought up with. And perhaps there are some people here who hold to Marxist ideas or certain other ideas that have a certain currency still, but are held by a minority. But nevertheless, there's a limited spectrum of ideas that we've got. But I think that the well of human social thought is not exhausted. And I think there are always going to be new groups of people who have new ideas on how society should be organized and governed. And in general, these people are not going to be terribly popular with everybody else. And it may be that by going to Mars, they will have a chance to give their ideas a run. And who knows, they could be right. And, you know, the ideas that we accept as the basis for organizing society were held only by a small minority of people in Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries. People who believed this stuff were thought to be perhaps pleasantly insane, but not accepted. But when the colonies came into being and became independent and were able to give these ideas a run, and with all their imperfections were able to produce a form of society that offered more for human potential than anything that had been existed before, people then voted with their feet to come here, and ultimately societies in Europe emulated it in one way or another, and it became the pattern and the standard for the world. So I think that, you know, right now, you know, for all its faults, what seems to work best is democratic capitalism, but it's certainly a form of society that's got a lot of problems to it, and one would hate to think that this is the best we can do. But so it may be that some group establishing a colony on Mars will have a chance to put into being some new ideas. I don't know what they'll be. Come up with something better, and if it is better, the example will be followed.
Right, we can learn a lot from them.
I would add that in the early North American colonies, there were numerous monetary systems. There were New York dollars and Connecticut dollars and so forth. These rose and fell with the fortunes of the governments. There was an expression, "It's not worth a continental," meaning that the currency printed by the Continental Congress was pretty much valueless, but the nation survived. I would also say that I'm glad that it's going to be a while before they're big enough for mortgage derivatives trading up there.
As several of us were just reflecting on the fact that we did indeed just get our national credit downrated from AAA to AA. The system, yeah, just came out from Washington Post. The system seems to have kind of run to its end.
So we now pay more, we'll pay more in interest. It's costing us money.
Okay, may I be so bold as to add to the potpourri of discussion what I feel is one of the most controversial of all subjects related to the colonization of Mars. Bear with me. Antarctica was divided among nations. They drew lines. Some nations were excluded from those treaties. How did we divide Antarctica? Is it open international territory, or is it national territory in their definition of the boundaries? Now, to take the argument or the issue of the territorial divisions of the preferred settlements on Mars. There will be an argument someday of how do we establish settlements. Are those settlements all going to be international, or will they be national? Will nations have conflicts related to the territorial division, of which are the more preferable geological survey results, or will they be spread around that lottery? How will the settlements and their rights to these settlements be divided among the let's say 500 nations of the world, or every nation of the planet Earth? We must come to an agreement. What will be the vehicle for that agreement? Will it be the United Nations, or it will be another organization? And I believe that's where the sparks are going to fly in the future.
Yeah, God help us if it's the UN. Antarctica is the perfect example of what we don't want to see. I've heard this model of Antarctica floated in various circles into the idea of what we really need to do is treat Mars like Antarctica, which means basically waste a continent and use it for a handful of doctoral candidates to go and try out their theses on, which is to say, never effectively colonize the place. To anticipate somebody else's argument, anyone who can get there, feel free to try. That narrows the field fairly quickly, and I don't see why we should engage in international charity, at least on a hypothetical basis, if basically what it means is taking the capacity of the nations they're prepared to sacrifice to accomplish it and give to those that are not in the position to do so. Or are unwilling to do so.
Yeah, at some other conferences, other organizations, there are long tracks on legal precedent, legal laws, international laws related to outer space. There's the Moon Treaty, the Outer Space Treaty. I won't speak to them. As far as Antarctica, I believe there's an Antarctic treaty that says the nations won't fight each other over their claims for some number of years. But after that number of years, then you can go ahead and fight over it. There also is definite legal precedent internationally that if you settle someplace, you have the right to be there and the right to a certain amount of territory around it. We call it homesteading. But one of the treaties said that basically the moon will not be claimed by any sovereign country. And I've heard talks from mining experts and legal experts who say there is precedent that if you go out in international waters and do labor, such as collecting fish or pulling minerals off the bottom of the ocean, that the fruit of your labor is your property. So you get to keep the fish or keep the minerals. And they generally think that that would apply to the moon and Mars as well. So if you put down a settlement, even if international law doesn't let you claim the land, you can still produce, you can still mine it and produce goods and sell the goods. I think these laws are going to be made by the people who are there, and certainly they're going to be the only one enforcing them. I don't think any nation is going to claim territory on Mars. Well, that's true in international waters and international space. It's not true inside a sovereign country. So I can't. Yeah. I can't go to China and grow rice and keep the rice. But yeah.
All right. Let's take the next question.
Yeah, Mark Toy. This is just a brief comment on from an earlier convention and something I thought was relatively delightful in attitude. I think it was the second Mars Society convention. There was a group of Italian academics who gave a little chat on psychological issues involving like expeditionary groups under harsh conditions. And their layout for a Martian habitat, permanent habitat, they put their dining facilities at the center. That was the focal point of their entire life. And they were insisted that all people in these small groups, they get along better and resolve a lot of issues if they all ate together, or sat down and ate together as a family. And they were quite adamant that no splinter groups, 2, 3, 4 people, be allowed to eat earlier or later or something like that. And I just thought this was really a neat attitude on life, and that would be beneficial.
Well, let me just say something about that. With respect to small groups, that is true. It certainly, for instance, in the Mars HABs, the crews that cohere together are definitely the ones that eat at least dinner together as a group, and that and the wardroom table is definitely the place where people tend to congregate. Now, that's fine if you've got 6 people, okay, but if you've got 40 people, that's clearly not.
They pointed out from a safety perspective, like you said, if there was a small group, you had an informal situational awareness of what the others were doing throughout the day, and you could kind of accommodate. Anyway, I thought it was a delightful, typical Italian attitude.
All right.
And
Well, I think the Italians have something to. I think they're absolutely right. On submarines, on military ships, in expeditionary situations, coming together for a meeting, for a meal, is often the big social event of the day. It does indeed bring people together, particularly when the meal is something special. On submarines, they have weekly special meals, sometimes with entertainment. Down at Antarctica, they celebrate every holiday that comes along. They don't miss a single one. And it's in order to give the crew, which down in Antarctica is several hundred during the Antarctic summer, to give them something to look forward to, something to do together, a reason to go and meet and talk to other people that they don't usually meet and talk with. So dinner and special meals are a very important part of having good morale on with a fairly small expedition. Once the colony gets settled to the point where there are family groups, then I think the idea of communal meals may vanish, or who knows, it may persist as it does in the kibbutzes.
Let's take these last 4 questions and let's take them quickly. Quick questions, quick answers.
Rick Smith. Let us say that the Mars colony has grown to the point where it's expensive for Earth to supply it. The colonists are trying to become independent. My question to the panel is, what industry or what problem do you think the Martian colonists are going to have the hardest time bootstrapping themselves up to be able to do? What is going to be an industry that's really hard for them to develop?
Things that require a very large division of labor. That's what it is.
Yeah, specialties of labor. I might be integrated circuits unless they just import a machine. It might be getting a variety of medicines.
Next.
Christopher Martins. I think humans do a couple of things really well, and that's adapt and survive. I think we'll do fine on Mars. I think that the people that stay there for more than 2 years probably won't want to come back for a number of reasons. The people that are born there might not ever be able to come back. But I think what people outside this room don't realize is we're not going to Mars to spread humanity to another planet. We're going there to become Martians.
All right. True enough. Next.
What the last guy said, pretty much, like, I'm kind of thinking...
Closer to the mic.
Or move
I'll
the
just
mic
yell.
down.
I'm kind of thinking way into the future, kind of, but I mean, a little bigger than a colony, but I mean, everyone's expressing these concerns for messed up kids being born and all this stuff. Do you think there's any possibility that we could evolve? Like, everyone's saying adapt, but I mean, evolution, you know?
I think it's highly likely that that once the parameters are well understood, that a colony, an independent colony with the capability to make their own genetically engineered plants would seriously consider genetically engineering their own children for better survival and thriving in their new environment. We regard this with great skepticism on Earth partly because we know that we're well adapted to Earth. But personally, I don't see a problem with doing that on Mars for children who are born there who want to live there.
Yeah. Let's just take this. We're out of time, so let's just take them.
Just one closing comment since I'm last. I looked at your charts that you put up there with a lot of interest, and the list of all of the issues and items that you think need to be solved. And if I could change one word on the last chart, you said project management will be a challenge. I would change A to the. Project management will be the challenge. My experience of over 30 years of managing projects is that we can solve just about any technical problem we put our mind to. We just screw up by not managing it properly. That's why we're still here on Earth and not on Mars.
Good way to end.
All right, true enough. All right. So our next panel will be that on the space and media. Would the panelists please come up forward?